The Kushites lived in Sudan, North Africa, the Levant, and Anatolia. Around 800 BC, Homer mentions the Ethiopians, or Kushites, in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homer said that the Kushites were the most just of men, the favorites of the gods. To the Greco-Romans, there were two Kush empires, one in Africa and the other in Asia. Homer alluded to the two Kushite empires when he wrote in the Odyssey 1:23, "A race divided whom the sloping rays, the rising and the setting sun surveys." In the Iliad 1:423, Homer wrote that Zeus went to Cush to banquet with the blameless Ethiopians. In 64 BC, the Greek geographer, historian Strabo, stated in chapter 1 of Geography that there were two Kush empires, one in Asia, another in Africa. In addition to Kush and Nubia and Upper Egypt, some Greco-Roman authors considered their presence in southern Phoenicia up to Mount Aramus in Syria. Although in a sense we know that there was a Kushite empire in Africa and a Kushite empire in Asia, and that these Kushites originated in Africa, many people are trying today to make a false history. In this false history, they're claiming that those civilizations that the Kushites made were done by aliens from outer space. It was the aliens who built the pyramids, they tell you. It was the aliens who built these grand cities. It was the aliens who traveled around the world and left their culture and their signature. It was not aliens, it was black people. These people were the Kushites. It was the Kushites who took this around the world. It wasn't any aliens from outer space. It was the Kushites who built these great civilizations that Europeans still don't know how they constructed them. The Pelasgians, in a sense, were black people that lived in Europe. Pelasgians also had writings and kings. On the vases, we see a funeral procession. Here's a very interesting vase made by these blacks in Europe. On this part of the vase, we see a swastika and a number of painted signs that look like RM. When you interpret these signs, they tell us much about these black people, these Kushites. The swastika is read as Kaka, deliverance, protection, and safekeeping. The M sign reads to rain, to fall, pour down. These signs, when they read together, says rain down safekeeping for the deceased. Isn't this an apt description of what's on this vase? Here we see a deceased person laying on a funeral pyre, and around it, his people worshiping him. This is Pelasgian text over 3,500 years old. The Neolithic process in North Africa was done by Africans, who took the agro-pastoral cultures to the Levant and Europe. These agro-pastorians or Kushites were what we call today the Niger-Congo speakers. The Niger-Congo speakers originated and played an important role in the Sahara and later in the rest of the world. The scholar Dr. Drake et al. Makes it clear that there was considerable human activity in the Sahara before it became a desert. Drake et al. Provides evidence that the original settlers of the West Sahara who used aquatic toolkits were Nilo-Saharan speakers. These authors also recognize another Saharan culture that played an even greater role in the history of mankind and also lived in the Sahara. This population hunted animals with bows and arrows. They are associated with the Unanian culture. The Unanian culture existed 12,000 years ago. The early Neolithic Moroccans can give us great insight into some of the genes carried by these Kushites. The early Neolithic Moroccans, who were really in a sense Unanians, were nothing more than hunter-gatherer Kushites that originally belonged to the Onanian culture. The Onanian cultures, like their Kushite descendants, were great archers and based their civilization on hunting, using the bow, and limited cattle domestication. The Onanian culture was first described by Burrell in 1930 at Unan in the south of Tour-Denis in northern Mali. Unanian points, or arrowheads, are suggested to be the hallmark of some of the Epi-Paleolithic industries in the Central Sahara, the Sahel, and northern Sudan, and dated to the early Holocene period. The Onanian culture is associated with sites in Central Egypt, Algeria, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger. The Onanian tradition is probably associated with the Niger-Congo phyla. This would explain the close relationship between the Niger-Congo speakers and the Nilo-Saharan speakers and their languages. The original homeland of the Niger-Congo speakers was probably situated in the Saharan highlands during the Onanian period. From here, Niger-Congo speakers migrated into the Fezzan in Libya, the Nile Valley, and Sudan, as their original homeland became more and more arid as the Green Sahara became a desert. In the eastern Sahara, many individual types of tangled and shouldered arrowheads occur on early Holocene prehistoric sites along the Green Sahara, along with wavy line pottery. They call this pottery Saharo-Sudanese, and this is placed in the Saharo-Sudanese Neolithic, where they made wavy line, dotted wavy line, and walking cone pottery. This pottery is used from Lake Turkana to Nata Playa in Tibet, in Mauritania, and into the Hayar and in Niger. This pottery evolved into what we call the beaker bell ceramics in Europe. Yes, you hear so much about the beaker bell ceramics or pottery. They talk about these beaker bell people being Indo-European speakers. That's a lie. The beaker bell ceramics were made by black people, the Kushites. The Onanian culture was not isolated to Africa. It was spread into the Levant. As a result, we have in the archaeological literature the name Unan Harif points. This name was proposed for the tangled points in Nata Playa and Bir Kisirba. Here you can see a tangled point. Harifian is a specialized regional cultural development of the Epipaleolithic of the Negev Desert. Harifian has close connections with the late Mesolithic cultures of Fayum in the eastern deserts of Egypt, whose tool assemblages resemble that of the Harifian. The tangled Unanian points are also found at Forum Algium. These points were used at Oued Ra in southern Morocco to the Banque d'Ajoun, and from the Atlantic shore of the lowlands of northwestern Sahara and Mauritania. We now have DNA from the Onanian sites in Morocco. This is exciting news because this shows that black people were already carrying the so-called Eurasian haplogroups. There are no Eurasian haplogroups. Man originated in Africa. Therefore, these haplogroups had to have appeared in Africa first and not in Europe. These Unanian people or Kushites, they moved from place to place. They had wagons and chariots. All the burials of Ifrik Amir al-Musa site are devoid of any artifacts except for an original funeral ritual, which consists of placing millstones in skulls. These burials dated from 4,850 to 5,250 years before the present were examined by many archaeologists and geneticists. They found that these ancient Africans carried U6, haplogroup M1, haplogroup T2, haplogroup X, and haplogroup K. This shows that Africans were already carrying these mitochondrial DNA haplogroups. The spread of the Onanian to Harif in the Levant explains the presence of these Kushite clans in the Levant and Anatolia. In summary, the Niger-Congo speakers or Kushites formerly lived in the highland regions of the Fezzan and Horar until 4000 BC. The ancestors of the Kushites were the Unanians who spread the Unan Harfin toolkit, pottery and arrows, from throughout North Africa into Iberia, which is in Spain, and the Levant. Originally hunter-gatherers, the Proto-Niger-Congo people developed an agro-pastoral economy, which included the cultivation of millet and domestication of cattle and sheep. It was these Kushites who introduced mtDNA U6, M1, T2X, and K, and the Y chromosome R1b and R1a into Eurasia from their African homelands in the Sahel-Sahara. Eurocentrists attempt to limit the extent of the Kushite Empire. The Winnie inscription makes it clear that many states were inhabited by the Haks, or Kushites. This map above makes it appear that only the Ikrit was Cush, but the Winnie scriptures include Wawat, Yam, and Temek as being inhabited by Kushite Hast. The inscription of Winnie reads, His Majesty made war on the Asiatic sand dwellers, and His Majesty made an army of many 10,000s. In the entire south, southward to Elephantine, and northward to Afrotopolis, or Busiris, is the northland. On both sides, entire in the stronghold, in the midst of the stronghold among the Ikrit Kushites, the Mazui Kushites, the Yam Kushites, among the Wawat Kushites, and among the Kau Kushites, and in the land of Temek. This word Temek is very important. In the Winnie inscription, we can clearly see that Kushites were living in Upper and Lower Egypt. The final comment in the Winnie inscription made it clear that the Kushites were also in the land of Temek. On this map, Temek is situated to the south of Earthlit, but in Egyptian, Temek meant Lower Egypt. That means the delta region of modern Egypt. The Egyptians made it clear that Lower Egypt was called Temek, and Upper Egypt was called Tashima. Because the Kast, or Kushites, were living in Lower Egypt when the kings of Hekkas took control of Egypt during the Hyksos period, they were returned to the lands of their ancestors. As Hyksos, or Kushites, they were the kings of Kushites. They were not Asians. They were not foreigners. These were black people who had been to Asia and settled Asia and made it a very powerful place for black civilizations and culture. The Kas or Kushites belonged to the Sigru people and lived in Upper and Lower Egypt between 3,700 and 1,300 BC and were called Temehus. The Temehus were organized into two groups, the Tehinu in the north and the Nahisi in the south. Sahura, a great pharaoh of the Egyptians, referred to the Tehinu leader as Hati Tehinu. The name Hati corresponds to the name Hatti, a tribe of Anatolia. However, the Hatti people often referred to themselves as Kushkas, correspond to Hakis or Kas, and the Haksas were identifying their ethnic origin when they called themselves Kas, or the kings of Kush. It is very important to understand that every day the history of African people, the history of black people is being stolen. They're teaching a false history, and this history that they teach is a history that the great people of ancient Europe, the great people of Europe before 1200 BC, they say were not black, but they were black. These are the Kushites, the great travelers, the most important people in the history of the ancient world. Yes, the Kushites lived in North Africa, the Sudan, the Levant, and Anatolia.